Harry M. Stevens rose from hardscrabble origins to earn acclaim as the world's greatest sporting caterer and a true pioneer in the field of gastronomy. After emigrating from his native England as a young man in 1881, Stevens spent several years as a $2 a day laborer at a rolling mill in Niles, Ohio, before entering the sports world a few years later as a scorecard vendor at a minor league ballpark in Columbus. At the start of the next decade, Stevens made the jump to the majors, and in 1894 he acquired the scorecard concession at New York's Polo Grounds. Soon, Harry Stevens' publisher could be found on baseball scorecards most anywhere. His affable demeanor and boundless energy earns him the first of two enduring nicknames, Scorecard Harry. Never one to rest on his laurels, he then recognized the opportunity to expand into food and drink. The baseball games begin in the middle of the afternoon as a general rule, and that means the spectator has had his lunch, Stevens later explained. The crisp air sharpens his appetite, and he wants something to eat to satisfy this craving before he goes home to dinner. He has no time to leave his seat between innings, so he wants something he can eat while watching the game. After several years of hawking a limited menu of simple items like ham and cheese sandwiches and peanuts, his son Frank bluntly informed him that only hunger and the lack of alternatives led fans to purchase such offerings, and that sales would skyrocket if spectators could buy appetizing hot food. In the spring of 1901, Stevens unveiled sausages packed between two buns, and with that, a corporate empire was born. Harry Stevens didn't invent the hot dog, but so many Americans bought their first hot dog from Stevens or one of his vendors that his name became inextricably associated with its sudden popularity. Vendors with heated buckets filled with hot dogs became a commonplace sight at ballparks of the early 20th century. And as his son had predicted, spectators who had previously left the game early to rush home for dinner instead began to supplement their hot dog with a cold beverage, a snack, and perhaps a sweet, allowing them to enjoy an ad hoc meal as they watched the game. In recognition of his expanded role, Scorecard Harry gradually became known as Hustling Harry. Harry Stevens' success story was a highly visible one because he and his rapidly growing staff of vendors were a constant and conspicuous presence in Major League grandstands and bleachers. Long after achieving considerable wealth, Stevens stayed closely involved in every aspect of his business and remained a familiar figure in the grandstands and bleachers of the Polo Grounds. Even more attention was directed his way when the hot dog attained iconic status and when baseball's unofficial anthem, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," celebrated the fans' opportunity to buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. Magic lantern slides that helped popularize the 1908 baseball song even featured the song's protagonist, Miss Katie Casey, eating food at the ballpark. Yet the growth of Hustling Harry Stevens' concessions business was merely the most visible element of a much larger story that saw a host of enterprising turn-of-the-century Americans find new ways to market and sell baseball-themed goods, and to advance the success of the game itself. The intersections between corporate America and the National Pastime date all the way back to the strictly amateur clubs of baseball's earliest years. While membership dues paid for most club expenses, it was not uncommon for club members to solicit contributions from local merchants to replace a fence or purchase new uniforms. Members of the local business community were usually glad to chip in the comparatively modest sum that was needed, and the grateful ball players might reciprocate by directing more potential customers to their doors. In 1868, for instance, a Buffalo newspaper published a note informing its readers that a gold ball won by that city's Niagara Club was on exhibition at S.N. Lawrence & Sons' furnishing goods establishment number 345 Main Street and inviting them to visit the store to admire it. 19th century America buzzed with entrepreneurial spirit and rags to riches tales, so it's probably safe to say that no new product or trend showed much sign of popularity before some enterprising individual began burning the midnight oil to devise a way to make money from it. That was certainly true of baseball during its early years, but the results were almost invariably disappointing. Large crowds were already assembling to watch baseball games by the end of the 1850s, making it easy to envision sizable profits. A major step was taken in that direction in 1858 when admissions fees were successfully collected at a 3-game series played at the Fashion Racecourse in Astoria, New York. Making money from baseball now appeared to be downright easy. All it required was an appropriate site for a diamond and 9 ball players before the money started rolling in, right? Wrong. As soon became evident, 2 features of the series in Astoria had been unusual, which meant that similar gate receipts could not always be counted upon. The first such feature was that those games were essentially all-star contests, pitting Brooklyn's best players against their Manhattan counterparts. With Brooklyn still a separate city with a distinct identity, many spectators turned out for these games to support their hometown and witness a special event, so they would not necessarily be willing to pay to watch less momentous games. The second unusual feature was the fence around the Fashion Racecourse, which made it much more practical to charge for admission than when the site was an open field. Thomas Fitzgerald, the president of the Athletic Club of Philadelphia, discovered this reality the hard way. Although Philadelphia was a baseball hotbed and the Athletic Club a national powerhouse, when he tried to sell tickets for a much anticipated game at an unenclosed playing field in 1864, the entrance charge was considered more or less as a joke by nearly everybody. Most members of the large crowd simply walked to another part of the field to watch, and to Fitzgerald's dismay, a paltry $14 was collected. Entrepreneurs began to erect enclosed ballparks to address the problem, and many of them experienced initial success. The first such ballpark, the Union Grounds in Brooklyn, opened in 1862 and served a dual purpose, hosting baseball games during the ball-playing season and serving as a skating rink during the wintertime. But when competitors rapidly sprang up, the marketplace became crowded, causing profits to diminish. An even more daunting problem presented itself when the players took advantage of that competition to demand a hefty cut of the proceeds. Knowing that the games could hardly take place without players, the ballpark owners reluctantly accepted their terms, but the new arrangement seemed like having a partner who shared in the revenue, but not the expenses. Ballpark ownership became a much less attractive proposition. An even more intractable problem also loomed. From the start, 50 cents was often charged for admission, and while that sounds like a pittance today, for a laborer who was supporting a family on $2 a day, it represented a major expense. An even more troublesome issue was that it excluded the children who were the game's most enthusiastic supporters. If baseball continued to turn away the next generation of fans, its future would be bleak indeed. When baseball's openly professional era began in 1869, the leverage of the players enabled them to assume an even more dominant role. Shareholders typically provided the capital for professional teams, but there was so much competition for the services of talented players that their salaries ate up much of the revenue. Red ink was the norm, with even the legendary Red Stockings of Cincinnati posting only a meager profit of $1.39 during their triumphant 1869 season. 1 year later, the historic team disbanded because, as the club president sadly explained, you can wave the Star-Spangled Banner and talk about the glory of the Red Stockings and the nine that meets with no defeat, but you must put your hands in your pockets and pay the bills. You can't run the club on glory. With no check on the leverage of the players, they had the biggest say in team and league decision-making when baseball's first professional league, the National Association, began play in 1871. As for the financial backers of these teams, profits remained so elusive that few received any dividends, while teams were apt to abruptly disband in mid-season, leaving so many unpaid bills that the investment had to be written off as a learning experience. These ongoing efforts to make baseball a paying proposition also revealed that, for all the fans who could afford to buy tickets, there were many more who had no intention of paying for something that they were accustomed to enjoying for free. As a rule, such disgruntled ex-supporters simply stayed home, but a surprising number found ways to watch for free. When poor ticket sales forced a National Association team in Keokuk, Iowa to disband in 1875, the local paper angrily explained that men and boys who would scorn to steal into a circus under the canvas will sit on an adjacent fence and take in a ball game that other people pay their 25 or 50 cents to see. This deep-seated resistance to the very idea of paying to watch a baseball game carried over to attempts to persuade paying customers to fork over more money to purchase merchandise. Some of this wrath was directed toward the predecessors of Harry Stevens. Hereafter, the vending of peanuts, lemonade, etc. in the grandstand should be prohibited, declared a journalist in Michigan. People purchase seats there to see the game and not to gaze on the oft-appearing form of the peddler, who is sure to stand just in front of you when a fine play is being made. An indignant public will gratefully remember the manager who will ban these bores from all grandstands forever. In light of the many risks, most shrewd entrepreneurs concluded that baseball was a fundamentally unsound business proposition. To be sure, large crowds still turned out on occasion, but with lingering hostility to the whole idea of professional baseball, and with attendance further dependent on a long list of variables that included weather, injuries, and the strength of the opponent, there was seemingly no way to predict or control whether the grandstands would be full. A 21st century firm that faced such a predicament might choose to launch a promotional campaign to increase ticket sales. But while our leisure hours are now so frequently bombarded with commercial messages that we usually just try to tune them out, 19th century Americans lashed out in response to such intrusions. When the 1869 Red Stockings visited San Francisco, for instance, one of the local organizers arranged a 10-minute intermission after the sixth inning in hopes of generating additional concession sales to offset the expenses. But one reporter fumed that the interlude was just a dodge to advertise and have the crowd patronize the bar. Likewise, in 1875, efforts to publicize a tournament in western Michigan led a resident of a neighboring village to complain. Posters and bills announcing the tournament are scattered about town in such profusion as to give one an idea that little villages were made for the sole purpose of proclaiming and making known to the public. The hostility displayed in some of these examples seems extreme. The intermission staged at the game in San Francisco may well have contributed to establishing the tradition of the seventh inning stretch, while vendors like Harry Stevens helped ballpark food attain a similarly iconic status. But at heart, the backlash against commercializing the ballpark experience is understandable. Using the slogan, 8 hours for what we will, 19th century working class Americans had staged a lengthy campaign for shorter work hours, so it upset them to have that hard-won leisure time constantly interrupted with requests to open their pocketbooks. The formation of the National League in 1876 shifted control of baseball's finances from the player to the team owner, making it possible for aspiring entrepreneurs to devise schemes for improving ticket sales. But these did not always go as planned. In 1878, for instance, a new National League entry in Indianapolis plastered the city with bills that featured images of catcher Silver Flint and pitcher Ed Nolan with the inscriptions, "The Champion Catcher of America" and "The Only Nolan," the latter a shortened version of the one and only. The novel tactic did indeed garner plenty of attention, but much of it took the form of discussion about the good or bad taste of hanging up such pictures in the windows about town, and about whether the ads put more of a load on Nolan than he can carry. Spectators soon joined in laughter at the expense of the unfortunate pitcher, hollering derisive references to "the only Nolan" whenever he had a shaky outing. With ticket sales not receiving the expected boost, Indianapolis pulled out of the National League after a single season, and as for Nolan, his entry in baseball's record book still lists him as "the only Nolan." Some teams ignored that chastening example and made more blatant attempts at commercialization, provoking an even fiercer backlash. In Rochester, New York, a minor league team called the Hop Bidders was sponsored by the Hop Bidders Manufacturing Company, one of many firms of the era that sold so-called patent medicines more noted for their high alcohol content than their medicinal qualities. This infuriated renowned journalist and temperance proponent Henry Chadwick, who termed the Hop Bidders a mere advertising dodge and went to considerable lengths to avoid referring to the team by name. Similarly, when an ostensibly amateur team in Jacksonville, Florida, sported uniforms displaying the name of a local bookstore that provided a suit of clothes to each player, an irate journalist insisted that the loved name of amateur, which touches the better part of man, is outraged and abused when it is made merchandise for gain and greed, or betrayed to the common uses of the advertiser. With anything that smacked of commercializing baseball apt to cause such resentment during the 1870s and 1880s, any effort to suggest an association between a ball club and another business required great delicacy. 2 years after the National League released its first league-wide schedule in 1877, merchants in 2 league cities earned praise for printing and giving away pocket schedules that also featured a firm logo. Those schedules proved to be convenient and popular because they were free and met a need, but there was still understandable reluctance to attempt anything on a larger scale. The idea of selling advertising space on outfield fences, for example, was first proposed in the mid-1870s, but it was a full decade before any team was willing to risk a public backlash by actually doing so. The first known instance of a ball player endorsing a commercial product was also suitably modest. In 1877, a professional catcher named John Dolan offered a testimonial for a particular lineament's ability to soothe the pain of a very sore hand, sprained while catching a fly ball. With attendance so dependent on factors that were beyond the control of any owner, and with efforts to boost revenues not only ineffective, but often provoking a backlash, many entrepreneurs decided that the baseball industry was not for them. In the dominant philosophy of 19th century American business, sometimes referred to as the classical business model, the soundest investments were ones in which the expected profits were based upon the relatively predictable activities of manufacturing or stocking goods to meet prepaid orders or well-established marketplace trends, rather than the unpredictable activity of trying to stimulate demand. This made baseball teams look like very dubious ventures, and even those who chose to invest in one were likely to do their best to adhere to this philosophy by focusing their energies on the elements of the business that were easier to control, such as reducing expenses. But this laissez-faire approach was only ideally suited to industries in which the product was already both necessary and familiar to consumers. In the baseball industry, in stark contrast, the product was a baseball game and therefore a luxury. And there was lingering resistance to the idea for paying for it at all. It was a confounding dilemma with no easy solution. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that in the first 2 decades after the founding of the National League, the owners of professional baseball teams all too often overreacted to the unpredictability of crowd size by making the serious mistake of acting as though nothing they did had any effect on attendance. To be sure, aggressive advertising campaigns did little to help, but there were nonetheless many fans who followed the team and would be more inclined to visit the ballpark if they viewed the team and its owners in a positive light. Subtler forms of outreach that focused on solidifying public and press relations might well have accomplished much, but owners instead showed more inclination to snipe at reporters who published critical accounts, with several even trying to prevent Western Union from telegraphing game results. The fluctuations of attendance also made team owners too prone to act as though even customer satisfaction was beyond their control. During baseball's amateur years, spectators had been motivated by a combination of fondness for the game and civic pride, but the hiring of outside professionals had seriously diluted the latter, leaving a crying need for something to take its place. But ballpark amenities were scarce, and promotional initiatives almost non-existent. Only devoted baseball enthusiasts felt a compelling reason to enter a ballpark, and unless the home team won, it was even more unlikely for spectators to feel reason to smile as they exited. More inexcusably, such serious missteps were made in several instances that fans vowed never to return. From its inaugural season, for instance, the National League pursued a policy of refusing to give rain checks to spectators if one inning was completed before the cancellation occurred. Spectators were left both soaking wet and hopping mad, but the National League refused to budge in the years that followed. In response to this and similar slights, some disgruntled fans began finding new ways to watch games from outside the fences. And when teams tried to block their view by erecting taller fences, the relationship between fans and owners became downright toxic. By the turn of the century, however, necessity was forcing American businesses of all types to explore a wide range of ways to increase sales. While many of the nation's consumers once had little choice but to wait for a traveling salesman or drummer to stop by with his wares or trek to the general store, the proliferation of mail-order catalogs and department stores were causing them to feel needs that they never knew they had. Manufacturers had to adapt to the rapidly expanding mass market, and an increasing number of them tinkered with the classical business model by first perfecting a product and then stimulating demand for it. The automobile, for example, was initially viewed as a luxury for the very rich, so most manufacturers designed them with that market in mind. But a boyhood spent on a Michigan farm led Henry Ford to recognize that cars would be perfectly suited to farmers if only somebody built one with the features they needed and none of the luxuries that drove up the price. He then created the Model T with that market in mind, right down to reportedly instructing that the back seat be wide enough to transport 2 milk cans. As for color, he knew that farmers regarded that as a frivolity, so the Model T was available in any color you want just so long as it is black. Once Henry Ford had the product to fill that perceived marketplace gap, demand inevitably followed, and orders began pouring in. Signs of this new approach slowly began to enter baseball during these years. But with major league owners hesitant to embrace them, minor league and semi-professional teams led the way. Like Henry Ford, J. Wallace Page grew up on a farm in southeastern Michigan, and that background similarly inspired him to create a product suited to the needs of farmers. Barbed wire rapidly achieved popularity after its 1873 invention by Joseph Glidden, but the frequent injuries to livestock that brushed against its barbs led Page to design a modified version that instead used woven wire. But even after setting up a manufacturing plant and perfecting its design, he still faced the daunting problem that farmers needed to see its most important feature to appreciate its value. So in 1895, his Page Fence Wire Company sponsored an African-American barnstorming team called the Page Fence Giants and engaged the services of such players as Bud Fowler and future Hall of Famer Saul White. That approach had elicited protests in the 1870s. The times were changing, and a useful product like a fence was viewed much more sympathetically than a phony patent medicine. As a result, there was little backlash as the Page Fence Giants crisscrossed the country in a private touring railroad car and gained a reputation as the nation's premier African-American team, with Page Fence Wire Company representatives setting up demonstrations at games to explain the woven wire design to the curious. Harry Stevens also exemplified this new approach. It was still customary to present every business success story as a rags to riches tale accomplished by hard work. So profiles of hustling Harry dubbed him the man who parlayed a bag of peanuts into $1 million. Some even made the far-fetched claim that after losing his rolling mill job, he spent his last 50 cents on a ball game, and then while there, he had the bright idea of inventing the scorecard. In fact, the scorecard preceded Stevens by 2 decades, and while hard work was certainly crucial to his rapid rise, so too was his ability to anticipate demand. As we have seen, he began selling hot dogs because of his son's perception that they could help create a new market. Even his initial success at selling scorecards was based less on his sales touch in the bleachers than on his realization that more money could be made by convincing local businesses to purchase advertisements in them. By the new century, a new generation of major league owners that included former players like Connie Mack and Clark Griffith were showing the influence of these new ideas by using promotional and public relations techniques that spread the word about their teams in less abrasive ways and by making genuine efforts to monitor customer satisfaction. One of the first noteworthy examples occurred in the final years of the 19th century when Cincinnati business manager Frank Bancroft began regularly scheduling the Reds to play 2 games on the same day for a single admission price. Bancroft also coined an attention-grabbing term for these events: doubleheaders. 2 games had previously been staged on holidays, but nobody had ever tried to make them regular events because giving free products away flew in the face of accepted business logic. But Bancroft believed that fans would appreciate getting a bargain so much that the loyalty generated would offset the lost revenue. And the concept's success was such that other clubs began rushing to stage doubleheaders. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, teams unveiled numerous imaginative new promotions designed to increase fan allegiance. many of which would have seemed heretical to earlier generations of owners. For example, special days were held to honor specific groups, including Newsboy Day, School Children's Day, Boosters Day, and Flag Day. The first tentative experiments were made at offering caps and other free items to fans. There were also attempts to introduce forms of corporate sponsorship that engaged fans instead of alienating them. One notable example was the American Tobacco Company's Hit the Bull advertising campaign, which debuted in 1909. Large wooden bulls were placed deep in the outfields of Major League and minor league ballparks to publicize the firm's Bull Durham brand, with a $50 prize offered to any batter who hit one. The promotion proved costlier to the Cleveland Indians than to the tobacco manufacturer, as Cleveland star shoeless Joe Jackson was knocked unconscious when he literally hit the bull while chasing a fly ball in September of 1913. The Hit the Bull campaign was understandably shelved at that point, but the idea was eventually revived in a safer format, the famous hit sign, win suit advertisement at Ebbets Field. All of these outreaches showed ownership's new responsiveness, and their fan bases responded with deeper loyalty. One of the beneficiaries of these trends was hustling Harry Stevens. When he entered the baseball concessions business in the 1880s, his was a classic example of a small business that thrived by meeting an existing need. But his ability to anticipate and even create demand proved perfectly suited to 20th century American consumers who sought recognizable brands that they could trust. Major league teams began showing their appreciation of the value of brand identification by placing new emphasis on logos, team colors, and standard team nicknames. So too did Harry Stevens, whose business letterhead described him as a publisher and caterer from the Hudson to the Rio Grande, and whose concession staff served as many as 250,000 ballpark and racetrack customers on summer afternoons. Out of a typical 19th century small business, by the time of his death in 1934, Stevens had created the prototype of a brand new type of business, the franchise.
This one here had to be re-recorded. Number 18, The Business Behind the National Pastime. During the upload process, it was inadvertently deleted. So that's why this is a re-taping of lecture number 18, The Business Behind the National Pastime. So that's why this pretty much had to, I had to do it to keep the playlist continuous so we didn't miss any lectures. I probably could have redone the whole thing, but I just decided to do it this way. I don't know for sure if I can do a live premiere when this does post up to YouTube, but if it's able to be done that way, I will probably do that. But if not, at least you'll have the complete watch list. We do have 2 more episodes to go in the Play Ball lecture series. Episodes number 23 and 24 are still to be broadcast in the next 2 weeks. Okay, so take care. Lord bless you. Have a nice, great, and blessed day. And as the Bibster of all things Wax Pack says, be blessed.